In these precarious times, do people in work have to accept that the deal in life they thought they had has changed, or are they right that they've earned that deal and they should fight for it? That perhaps is the fundamental issue at the heart of next week's public sector strike, which the Chancellor today described as a self-inflicted wound to the British economy. But the protection of a pension is at the moment a more visceral issue than pay, and 2 million people are likely to strike in defence of it. Here's David Grossman.
The lessons of the 1926 general strike loom large in British industrial relations. For the unions, an example of how concerted action can have exponential impact. For the government, it showed that strikes can be defeated if the non-unionised middle class turns against them. In 1926, office workers replaced the strikers, shovelling coal to keep the power stations running. No question of that next Wednesday, but the government is trying to get other civil servants to staff passport control.
Well, I think it's an act of desperation. I mean, the day before they were offering to fly staff back from embassies around the world. Now they want people without any training to do a very important job at the borders. What they really should be doing is try to settle the pensions dispute.
For the Prime Minister, there were two good reasons for being at the Toyota plant in Derbyshire today. Firstly, the company has announced £100 million of new investment, guaranteeing and creating jobs. Secondly, and some would say a big factor in the company's decision, Toyota in the UK has never lost an hour's production to strikes.
We will do what we can, for instance, to make sure that our airports remain open and that our border queues are not intolerable. But everyone should be clear that there is going to be disruption, and the reason for that disruption, the responsibility for that disruption, lies squarely with the trade union leaders who've decided on a strike even while negotiations are ongoing. I think that is irresponsible, I think it is wrong, and people should know who to blame.
When Toyota was going through a downturn, the workers agreed a 10% drop in salary rather than face job cuts. The government is trying to get the public sector workers to do something similar, to agree a reduction in their pension entitlements. But so far, they haven't got near any sort of agreement, despite recently improving the offer. Dan Hodges used to work for the GMB union. He says that public sector unions are doing precisely what they're supposed to be doing.
Well, with respect to David Cameron, he can't have it both ways. Either the government aren't granting concessions to the trade unions, in which case it seems to me perfectly reasonable for the trade unions to say we've got no other option but to go on strike, or the government is granting concessions to the trade unions, in which case their action is already working and their strike action seems perfectly sensible.
As the unions leaflet workers outside the Treasury, many Conservative backbenchers want the government to legislate to ban strikes unless a majority of members are balloted. Ministers, though, fear that such action could seem inflammatory. Instead, they're talking about the cost of the strikes. £500 million, they say, in lost output.
Well, we hope that they won't be too damaging at all, but it very much depends whether public sector workers use the time between now and next Wednesday to look at the website, check what their pension will actually be, because at the end of this, public sector workers will still have pensions which will be the envy of most people in the workforce. Thanks.
Just like 1926 then, the government strategy is to get non-unionised opinion against the strikes. They are, ministers insist, striking to keep the benefits that you pay for and can't afford for yourself. The strikes have, of course, created a big problem for the leader of the opposition. Labour was founded and is funded by the unions, but Mr Miliband can't risk coming down on their side.
Strikes are always a sign of failure, and that's absolutely clear. And that's why I say no stone should be left unturned to prevent these strikes happening. And that's why it's a responsibility on both sides. And of course it's the case that I think throughout all of the services, basic services should be maintained, because everything should be done to make sure that the safety of the public is not put at risk by this.
There is, though, annoyance among some trades unionists that Mr Miliband can apparently be more supportive of the tents outside St Paul's than of public sector workers.
I thought he actually got it right back in June, where he took the stance of urging caution and distancing himself from the strikes. I equally think it's perfectly legitimate for the unions to go on strike, but I think Ed has slightly complicated matters with his unwise endorsement of the Occupy movement, and I think a lot of trade unionists and a lot of trade union members are legitimately going to say, well, if he can back the students and others camped all over the steps of St Paul's, why can't he back us?
In 1926, some of the big winners of the general strike were in fact the pit ponies, who had a holiday in the sunshine. The biggest problem for today's politicians is that no one can predict how long these strikes will go on, and unless you can know that, well, you can't know where public opinion is going to end up.
David Grossman, well, the Conservative MP Dominic Raab and the Assistant General Secretary of Unison, Karen Jennings, are both here. Karen Jennings, Ed Miliband said that strikes are always a sign of failure on both sides. Do you accept your role in that failure?
What I would say to Ed Miliband is that he needs to know the detail of what's happening in those discussions.
Don't you think he does?
No, I don't think he does know the detail. I don't think very many people do know what's going on in relation to the negotiations.
So
for example,
the opposition leader doesn't know the detail of what's going on in the negotiations.
If I may give you an example of what's happening in local government, the employers have said that they don't have the information from the Treasury to be able to negotiate. So they've gone away to try and get that information, and there are no talks now until after the industrial action has taken place.
Do you think that Ed Miliband would be more supportive then if he knew that? That's what essentially you're saying, he'd be more supportive if he knew the detail.
I think Ed Miliband was quite supportive today when he said, for example, that the tax that's going to be on public sector workers, 3.5%, 50% contribution rate on public sector workers only, and not a penny of that will go towards their pensions.
Dominic Raab, is it reasonable to put public sector workers in this position at the moment of feeling that they are so uncared for and undermined that they have to go on strike? People that have never considered going on strike in their lives.
I think you take some real moral acrobatics to come to that conclusion. Look, these strikes will be very damaging for the economy, whatever your estimate will be, at a time where we're very vulnerable economically. The reality for public sector workers in relation to pensions is that even after these reforms, they're going to have access to more generous pensions than the vast majority of private sector workers who are subsidising them to an enormous degree. But your average cabbie, your average carpenter, your average hairdresser will not be able to access them. They'll be subsidising them. And to top it all off, the triple whammy is they're going to face massive disruption to their lives from these strikes. It is unfair and totally irresponsible.
Irresponsible?
It's not irresponsible. We've had a ballot of our members. The vast majority of those that have responded are women who are deeply concerned, one, about public services, two, about what's happening to jobs, and three, that the pension that they've contributed to is being cut, and also that they're going to have to work much longer. This is deeply, deeply unfair. Now, there are trade unions that historically, for the first time, are going to take industrial action. Health service trade unions alongside Unison. This is democracy in action right across the public service.
And you would suggest that democracy in action is a very good thing. In defence of liberty, I mean, you talked about that. You would presumably endorse the right to strike and the right to make that decision.
Absolutely. For example, the European Convention talks about the right to strike, but it says it needs to be balanced with other freedoms and other people's freedoms, for example, to go about their daily business and their daily work. If you take the ballot for Unison, which is Karen's union, just 1 in 5 union members positively back this strike. If they cannot convince their own membership to support these strikes, it tells you volumes about the moral justice of the case, and that's why, of course... Well, hold on, just 1 sec. That's why the public overwhelmingly oppose these strikes, and I would urge Karen and leaders to think again.
You say the public overwhelmingly opposes these strikes. Have you taken a ballot?
All the polling from Comres in June through to YouGov this weekend show overwhelming opposition to these strikes. And it's obvious why, because the vast majority of private sector taxpayers cannot afford these.
How concerned are you about the public support or otherwise? Don't you think it's
disgusting that this government has shown no leadership over private sector people who very often do have poor pensions? But don't forget that public sector pensions, if you look at a local government worker, the average pension is £3,000. If you look at
But they're
a
being
health
protected.
service worker, it's 6,000.
But they're being
and
protected.
they want to. No, they're not
Of
being
course they are.
protected.
If
but they're
your
not.
pension
But
is
they're going to have to pay. But
15,000.
they're going to have to pay
Particularly.
more for their pension. You would accept that. They make a bigger contribution to their pension, and of course, it's a career average pension. But you do accept they make a bigger contribution.
There have been protections put in place for those earning £15,000 and £18,000. But yes, of course, look around us. You know, let's get a reality check here. Look at Europe. Look at the US. We have a massive debt crisis, and therefore, sure, we're making tough decisions. Of course, that comes with the territory. But I think it's incredibly self-indulgent to think that the public sector can be immune from any change in this way.
Do you accept that public sector workers should pay something more for their pension?
No, I don't accept that public sector workers should pay something more for their pension. Look, the average...
Your position, your negotiating position is not a penny more.
What we're negotiating at the moment is looking at a new scheme which might be different from a final salary scheme, and we're up for talking about that. But I don't see why we should increase the amount that people are paying towards their pension when the money that's being increased is going towards paying back the deficit. It's got nothing to do with their pensions.
Surely if you want, as you do, health service reform and education reform, you shouldn't be undermining the people that day in, day out deliver vital services for you.
Well, I don't think we are, and that's why the Treasury and the Cabinet Office made a very generous offer to try and bring this to a conclusion. Those workers approaching 10 years of retirement will not be affected by these changes, and so actually the government has gone probably too far.
Very briefly, can I just confirm, too far? Too far? Gone too far in the reform?
Sorry, so in what respect?
Do you think that actually critical operations on Wednesday will go ahead in hospitals?
Critical operations?
Yes.
Well, of course they will. Of course they will.
Thank you all very much.